If I could sum up today's passage in one word, it'd just have to be wow. I mean, this is bad stuff for Jesus, good stuff for us, because he suffered for us, but this is a painful time for Jesus. The fact that, you just can't, today's passage, you just can't make this stuff up. You can't make it up. No wonder Paul said about this, just the fact of that God would come down here in person and go through this for our sakes. It's no wonder my buddy David calls it the nearly too good to be true news, because it's so true, it's so good, it's just too good. Paul said this. I think Paul was pretty touched and amazed by it. Philippians 2:6-8. Who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Jesus couldn't sit there in the glory of heaven and watch his creation be condemned. So he took on the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, being found in appearances of a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Today we're going to finish chapter 18. We're going to go into chapter 19. Chapter 19 is my Gospel of John. Bob, professor in college, called it the death chapter. The death chapter. When I took world religions in college, we studied all the major world religions, and we studied the religions that sprang off from those religions. And every one of those religions had their own creation story, their own story about what happens after death, their own story of how you're reunited with whatever higher power they happen to believe in. But there's no story in all the religions of the world anything like the one we had, because all theirs are made up in the minds of men. Some of them are just so fantastically crazy that you just you can't wrap your mind around how they even made it up. But our story's true. It reminds me of David's words when he tried to wrap his mind around how much God loved him and how much God continually took care of him. And I just I generally read this passage in Psalm 139 weekly, the whole chapter, but I'll just read you this one verse. Psalm 139:6. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. It's just hard to wrap your mind around what's going on in this story of Jesus. Last week was the arrest. Over 600 people showed up to arrest Jesus, and Jesus ended up giving himself up willingly. I mean, that's what it was all about anyway. He came here for a purpose, and I guess they thought they were going to have to hunt him down and use a lot of force. Showed up with torches and swords and over 600 armed soldiers. The Bible says a cohort showed up, and that's what a cohort is, 600 Roman soldiers. But he gave himself up willingly. As soon as they started walking up, he walked out to them and said, "Who are you looking for?" And so they took him to Annas. Only John tells us that they took Jesus to Annas first. And then Annas sent him on to Caiaphas, and John doesn't talk about that. But when we look at the other gospel accounts, we're going to try to weave some of those in today. And that's what that handout basically does. It compares this last 24 hours of Jesus' life back and forth, so you can easily make reference and put the whole story together. And we'll try to piece a little of it together today. When we take into account the different details presented by these different gospels, we find out, and I told you last week, there are actually 6 phases to Jesus' trial, 3 Jewish and 3 Roman. He went to Annas first, that's phase 1. Annas sent him to Caiaphas in the Sanhedrin, phase 2. That was in the middle of the night, probably somewhere around midnight on Thursday night. going into Friday morning. That middle of the night death sentence was an illegal trial. They had a law that said they couldn't do a trial at night. So they didn't have, back there, they didn't have night court. Couldn't have a trial at night. Well, they did it anyway. Matthew 26, 59 through 60, the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death, but they didn't find any, but many false witnesses came forward. Jesus admits to the high priest that he's Messiah, the Son of God, Matthew 26, 65, and the high priest tore his clothes and said he has spoken blasphemy. This is a key phrase in today's lesson. Why do we need more witnesses? Look, now you've heard the blasphemy. What do you think? He is worthy of death, they answered. They spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him, and so the torture began. In order to satisfy their own law, they met again early in the morning so they could make it legal, make the trial legal. So the third phase of the trial. Luke 22:66 tells us this happened at daybreak. Matthew 27, 1 and 2 describes it like this. Early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people made their plans how to have Jesus executed. So they bound him and led him away and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. That's where today's passage picks up. Larry's going to read. It's so good to have Larry back. I mean, I've been missing you. I mean, I hate it when you beat me at cards when we play cards, but I've been missing you. So glad you're back. He's going to read for us today. Passage picks up in phase 4 of Jesus' trial where they sent him to Pilate. So Pilate went on, sent him to Herod. We'll cover that in a little bit. That's phase 5, and Herod sent him back to Pilate. 6 phases. Larry's going to read John 18, 28 through chapter 19, through the first part of verse 16. Larry.
Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the praetorium. It was early. They themselves did not enter the praetorium, so that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have handed him over." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourself and judge by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put any man to death." This was to fulfill the word which Jesus had spoken to show by what death he was to die. Pilate entered the praetorium again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kinship is not of this world. If my kinship of this world, my servants would fight that I might not be handed over to the Jews. But my kinship is not from this world." Pilate said, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king? For this I was born, and for this I have come into the world to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" After he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no crime in him, but you have a custom that you should release one man for you at the Passover. Will you have me release you for the king of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. Then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in purple robe. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you wearing a crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, behold the man. When the chief priests and the also saw him, they cried out, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, take him yourself and crucify him, for I have found no crime in him. Then the Jews answered him, we have a law, and by that law he ought to die, but because he made himself the Son of God. When Pilate heard these words, he was more afraid. He entered the praetorium again and said to Jesus, where are you from? But Jesus gave no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, you will not speak to me. Do you not know that I have power to release you and power to crucify you? Jesus answered him, you have no power over me unless it had been given you from above, and therefore he who delivers me to you has the greatest sin. Again, this Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king sets himself against Caesar. When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the pavement, and in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of the Passover, preparations of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, behold your king. They cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. Then he handed him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross to a place called the place of a skull, which they called in Hebrew Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. Pilate also wrote a title and put it on the cross, and it read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this title, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and Greek. The chief priest of the Jews said to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but this man said, I'm the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written.
Thank you, Larry.
Did I go too far?
It's all right. We went into next week, so we got a preview. That's good. Great. Can't imagine how terrible it was for God the Father to be watching all this go on to the Son. So Jesus meets Pilate. After legalizing what they had decided the night before, early in the morning, they took him to Pilate. Early in the morning. We're talking 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning when they showed up at Pilate's house. I don't know how many of you have had somebody bang on your door at 4 or 5 in the morning, but it's got to shake you up. I remember one time somebody started banging on this was a long time ago, somebody was banging on our door, just beating the heck out of it. It was about 3 in the morning. I got up, went to the door, opened the door. There was 2 policemen there. I looked out. There, I counted them. There was 2 fire trucks, 3 Edmond police, and 2 county sheriff's cars surrounded my house. And I said, what's going on? And they said, we need to come in and check your house. We think your house is on fire. I said, what? They said, yeah, somebody reported smelling smoke. I said, at 3 o'clock in the morning? Yeah, and it's really a strong smell. They came in, they went up in my attic, they went through the house. I looked out in the backyard. Some of them were climbing over the fence because they couldn't get the gate open, searching my whole backyard. They finally came up and said, it's right there. I'd been smoking ribs that day. And I had created so much smoke that it was lingering And so they'd smell that, somebody smelled the smoke. There wasn't any fire left, but it saturated. You know, I was smoking ribs all day long. I ate good. You know what they said? You got any left? We'd like to have a middle of the night snack. I said, no, we ate them all. So anyway, Pilate's there. He's at his house. Well, he's Jerusalem residence, the Praetorium. You know, I think Pilate was kind of wanting just a little vacation. Him and his wife were there in Jerusalem. I think they were probably expecting an uneventful trip. They were going to just kind of lay around and drink wine and eat cheese. Their normal residence was up in Caesarea Maritima by the coast. They would come down on these required feasts to make a presence, just to be seen. A lot of soldiers would be in town. The population of Jerusalem would just skyrocket during these required feasts, especially during the Passover. Hundreds of thousands of Jews coming in to observe the Passover, to make their sacrifices. So the potential for trouble was there. I doubt if Pilate was expecting anything like this. Trouble with a capital T showed up on his doorstep about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. And not only that, but these chief priests, these Jewish leaders, wouldn't even come in. Oh no, we can't come in. You might make us unclean, or you will make us unclean. So here's Pilate, drug out of bed in the morning. He knows that they think he's such a dirty person that he's going to defile them. Another reason he couldn't stand the Jews, so he has to go out to them. Verse 28 tells us these Jewish I like to call them the Jewish bosses, because it wasn't the normal Jewish people, but it was their leaders. They didn't want to be made unclean by entering his headquarters. Now, I think it's ironic. It's okay to murder Jesus, but it's not okay to go in the Gentile's house. You know, I mean, what's going on here? They wanted to be able to eat the Passover, so they couldn't afford to be made unclean. That year, Passover fell on the Sabbath. Sabbath was going to be 6 that evening is when it started. So they couldn't afford to be made unclean. So they made Pilate. Pilate had to go out to them. He goes out to them. Well, what are the charges? Well, instead of answering him, they smart off to it. Well, if he wasn't guilty, we wouldn't have brought him here. Oh, man. Now I know Pilate's getting upset. He can't stand the guys anyway. And now they're smarting off to him. If he was planning on a vacation, it just got ruined. Talk about Pontius Pilate for a minute. Marcus Pontius Pilate was his full name in Latin. He was the Roman governor. Official title was prefect. He held office from 26 to 36. He officially lived in Caesarea Maritima on the coast of the Mediterranean. Whenever he would come to Jerusalem, he would be at the Praetorium, the official residence of the highest Roman official in the district. Now, Pilate was a man of authority, but I got to tell you now, he had about the worst assignment in the Roman Empire. None of them could stand the Jews, and so who are you going to send out there to these guys? Pilate. I don't think he was all that well thought of by Rome, but he had some high-powered friends, and he got this office, and so they sent him out there. We'll send him out there to handle these guys. They call them dogs, the Jews. We'll send him out there to handle the dogs. Some people accuse him of being weak. He gave in to the Jews, but really, in reality, he was a ruthless man who had no use for the Jews and didn't hesitate killing them. We know, according to Luke, that he slaughtered a bunch of Galilean Jews as they were offering sacrifices It was a surprise attack, a gross display of disrespect for God. Luke 13:1. Now, there were some present at that time who told Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with his sacrifices. He sent soldiers in, killed people sacrificing, mixed their blood with their sacrifices. Josephus tells us that in order to abolish Jewish laws and with the intent of diminishing their privileges that they had previously enjoyed, when Pilate took office, he ordered his troops, thousands of soldiers, to surround Jerusalem, sent them into the city with images of the emperor attached to their ensigns. Later, the Jewish representatives, went up to Caesarea Maritima to demonstrate their displeasure with the new governor. He threatened them with death if they wouldn't leave. These Jewish people laid down in the streets and said, "Go ahead and kill us. We only have one God, and it's not Caesar." Kind of the opposite of what they're going to say here at the end of today's passage. The Pilate backed off. He actually kind of admired these Jewish demonstrators. If these guys are willing to give their life for their God, then I'll remove the images. And he did. I think we can maybe all relate to Pilate just a little bit. See, he did something he didn't really want to do. He turned over Jesus. He knew Jesus was innocent, but he was pressured into doing it. I think, I know for a fact in my life, I've done things that I've known were wrong because of pressure long ago. Hopefully I'll never do it again. People do things every day they know are wrong because of pressure from others. We try to tell our young people don't give in to peer pressure, but that's easier said than done. Now, Pilate didn't mind crucifying criminals, but he knew Jesus was innocent. So he gave in to the Jewish leadership because really he was afraid of losing his job. He had been turned in by the Jews, according to other historical documents, so many times, Rome was fed up with Pilate. These Jewish leaders didn't hesitate to send people to Rome to complain about Pilate. He was eventually removed from office by the Roman emperor because of the cruel way he treated the Jewish and Samaritan people. At one point in his career, he even ordered soldiers to dress as local civilians and beat to death hundreds of Jews protesting at him robbing the temple treasury so he could bring water into Jerusalem by building aqueducts. Josephus tells us that he was guilty of slaughtering many Samaritans who went to Mount Gerizim to worship. And because of complaints to Rome, that was the final straw. He was removed from office in 36 AD. Rome had finally had too many complaints about Pilate. He wasn't a good guy. I figure God allowed him to be in office because he could depend on Pontius Pilate to carry out God's plan. Jesus was meant to die at an appointed time, and he knew he could depend on Pilate, so he allowed him to be in office. Verse 31. Pilate says, if he's guilty, you guys judge him by your law. But we can't execute anyone, they said. It's interesting, that didn't stop them a few years later from executing Stephen. I think Pilate's finally beginning to figure out, I think my day's just been ruined. As he's standing out on that porch at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. So Pilate takes Jesus and he interviews him. Are you the king of the Jews? Is that your own idea? Am I a Jew? We know Pilate's irritated. Are you the king of the Jews? Mark 15:2. Asked Pilate. Yes, it is as you say, Jesus replied. Mark 15:3, he says the chief priests accused him of many things. So Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of? Jesus made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Even though the Jewish leaders were bent on putting an end to Jesus, Pilate, as we see from today's passage, was just trying his best to turn Jesus loose. But it wasn't meant to be. This was God's plan. Pilate was there to carry it out. Verse 37 and 38, Pilate acknowledges Jesus as king. You are a king then. Jesus affirms it, yes. And he came so people could know the truth about God, the truth about how to correctly serve and worship God, to show us what God's about. So Pilate asks a key question. What is truth? Question that most people today, and apparently even in Pilate's day, seems to include whatever you want it to be. Whatever you think is true must be true. You got your own form of truth. But that's just not the way truth is. Jesus said in John 14:6, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. We know there's an absolute truth. So Pilate calls on the Jews to make a big choice. You're going to have to make a choice. They turned Jesus over to the governor because they said they couldn't legally execute him. And the irony to that is they turned Jesus in on the basis, one of the bases was that he was a threat to the Roman government. And then they turn around and want the release of a person who really is a threat to the Roman government, Barabbas. The whole thing just didn't make sense. Didn't make sense to Pilate. Doesn't really make sense to me. You look back on it. But it was God's plan. God's plan doesn't really have to make sense to us. Custom was to release a prisoner at Passover, it says. Question we might ask is, whose custom was it? At verse 39, John has Pilate referring to it as your custom, like it was a Jewish custom, like it was their custom. Matthew says it was the governor's custom. Matthew 27:15, now it was the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. If we look back in history, it's kind of hard to decide if it really was a custom. If they thought it was a custom, whose custom was it? Here Josephus refers to a different governor. He doesn't refer to Pilate, but he refers to a governor after Pilate, releasing a prisoner to make the Jews happy, but not a murderer. And according to Jewish oral tradition, that refers to the Jews for a period of time sacrificing a lamb for one prisoner during Passover that would be released, but it couldn't be a murderer. Some think it was a custom started by Pilate when he first took office after that big demonstration up in Caesarea. He decided, I guess I need to make these Jews happy, keep the peace. So some historians believe Pilate actually started the custom, and that over the years, the Jewish leaders became so accustomed to it that it was kind of hard for them to tell whose custom it was. Theirs are Pilate's, but they were both used to it happening, and so they wanted it to happen now. But why would he offer up a known murderer? Doesn't say for sure, but my personal opinion is this. Pilate knew Jesus was innocent. He wanted to let Jesus go. So he figures, if I offer a choice between a known murderer and a man who's never done anybody any harm, it'll be a no-brainer. They're going to pick Jesus and let him go. They're not going to want this guy that's a known killer to go free. Matthew 26:16-18. At that time, they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, which one do you want me to release to you? Barabbas or Jesus called Messiah? For he knew it was out of self-interest they had handed him over. And I think Pilate thought it was going to be a no-brainer. I don't know what translation most people have these days, but some translations actually say this. At this time, they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Jesus Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, which one do you want me to release to you? Jesus Barabbas or Jesus called Messiah? Now, I looked it up in my Greek text, and in my Greek text, in brackets, it has the name Jesus Barabbas. So that means in some early manuscripts, they have his name, his first name as being Jesus also. Now, I don't know if it was, but I mean, if you want to talk about adding to confusion, you want this Jesus Barabbas or you want this Jesus Messiah released? You want me to release the king of the Jews? No, give us Barabbas. Now, Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. Pilate surely wouldn't wanted to let this man go because he had murdered a Roman soldier in an uprising. I would say both Pilate and Barabbas were shocked at the choice. Some people think that the crowds who called for Jesus to be crucified and the release of Barabbas were the same people that had been praising Jesus a few days before as he entered Jerusalem, but there's no reason to think that it was the same people. There were hundreds of thousands of Jews in town for Passover. According to Josephus, there were over 1 million. These Jewish leaders could have found plenty of people to take their side, especially if they offered them a little money. The name Barabbas means son of the Father. Another interesting thing about that name. You got the Son of God and you got the Son of the Father. Some people think he was the son of a Jewish rabbi. So again, Pilate asks, what crime has Jesus committed? Let's turn to Luke and Matthew for a few more details. Luke 23. Then Pilate announced to the chief priests and crowd, I find no basis for a charge against this man. But they insisted. He stirs up people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here. On hearing this, Pilate asked, is this guy a Galilean? And when he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod. Good. I'm going to send this guy to Herod. I won't have to make the decision. We'll let Herod make it. That's phase 5 of the trial. When Herod saw Jesus, he was pleased. Because for a long time, he'd been wanting to see him, Luke said. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform some sort of a sign. So yeah, Herod's excited. Man, bring him in here. Maybe I can see a miracle. I've heard about him. I want to see one. So he plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him, dressing him in an elegant robe. They sent him back to Pilate. Don't you know that made Pilate happy? Oh man, I thought I was rid of this guy. Now he's back. Phase 6 of the trial. Matthew 27. When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. I'm innocent of this man's blood. It's your responsibility. And the people answered, his blood is on us and our children. Then he released Barabbas to them. John 19:1, then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. I can't even imagine this. It was a common practice before a person was crucified to be flogged. Now, a lot of the prisoners never made it to the cross because they died during the flogging. The scene would have been a bloody one and an ugly one. During a flogging, the prisoners were either tied to a post or thrown to the ground naked. They were whipped with leather straps that were tipped with bone or lead pieces. Josephus says many times they were beaten to the point where their bones were visible. If you think Jesus just shed his blood for us on the cross, you're wrong. He was shedding blood here and all through the streets of Jerusalem as he carried his cross to the hill outside. Put a crown of thorns on him, and they crammed that down on his head, and he's bleeding there. He's a bloody mess. They put a purple robe on him and went up to him again saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they slapped him in the face. A sign of disrespect and rejection. Even though he wants to let Jesus go, finally Pilate has to hand him over because of the insistence of the Jewish leaders. Finally, they came up with a charge against him, at least, one that put fear into Pilate. He's claimed to be the Son of God, they told him. Blasphemy. And so Pilate is afraid, and so he questions Jesus. He takes him back in. Where exactly do you come from? Pilate tried to get Jesus to speak up by threatening him with his power. I can put you to death. Instead, Jesus takes over and says, if you knew who was really in charge, it's not you. Pilate's power was a result of the behind-the-scenes work of God carrying out his eternal plan. God's plan is not going to be sidetracked. It's not going to be derailed. Pilate was there because God allowed him to be there. We need to think about that in our own life. God has a plan for each of us. And many times we don't understand why something happens. Something happens in our life without rhyme or reason. We don't understand it. Maybe it's God trying to tell us something. Or maybe it's God working through us for the benefit of someone else, and we never even know it, but the other person does. Pilate was in a tight spot here. The Romans had their own set of gods. They believed in many different gods and goddesses for everything imaginable. They had a god or a goddess for anything you could think of. And in their minds, these gods and goddesses could come to earth at will, and they had sons and daughters. To Pilate, the possibility was very real that Jesus was in fact a visitor from one of these gods. Because when he heard that he claimed to be a son of God, he got scared. So he asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" Now he's not only fearing for his job, he's fearing for his life. Has one of these gods really come to earth? So John gives us a little bit of commentary as we find out that Pilate now has to make a decision. He has to put on his judge's hat. Officially, he has to judge this case and get it over with. John 19:12. From that moment, Pilate made every effort to release him. But the Jews shouted, "If you release this man, you're not Caesar's friend." There's a threat. He knew they wouldn't hesitate to go up to Rome. Anyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside. He knew it was time to judge him. He sat down on the judge's bench in a place called Stone Pavement, in Hebrew, Gabbatha. As if his decision wasn't hard enough. Now he gets a note from his wife. John doesn't tell us, but Matthew does. Matthew 27:17. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat. He's there. He's about to make a decision, and here comes a note. Here's something from your wife. Oh, good grief. Don't have anything to do with him because he's innocent. For I've suffered a great deal in a dream because of him. Pilate's a bad guy, but I kind of feel for him here in this situation. John tells us in another bit of commentary, it was the 6th hour, Roman time, 6 in the morning. All this stuff's been going on between the time they show up at Pilate's porch to now at the judgment. It's 6 in the morning. And John also tells us it was preparation day. That's very important that we understand that. Preparation day is the day the lambs were being slaughtered at the temple for the sacrifices and for the Passover meal that would happen that evening. We'll talk more about that next week. Remember when they took Jesus to Pilate, they wouldn't go in because they wanted to eat Passover. That was that night. At the temple, thousands and thousands and thousands. Remember, there's hundreds of thousands, if not a million, according to Josephus, Jews in town for Passover. At the temple, they were slaughtering thousands of lambs. That would be an all-day thing. There would be blood everywhere. Jesus' blood is the important one we need to think about. Pilate now knows he's in over his head. These self-righteous Jews are willing to blaspheme God, the God that they worship, the God that they said they would worship and not bow down to Caesar. If they're willing to blaspheme now and turn to Caesar, I'm in trouble. I've got to turn him loose. They said, we have no king but Caesar, ultimate blasphemy. The Jewish leaders willing to blaspheme God, the same thing they're charging Jesus with, just to get Jesus killed. Obviously, they had forgot the passages or just ignored them. We know they didn't forget them. Psalm 10:16, the Lord is king forever and ever. Psalm 24:10, who is he, this King of glory, the Lord of hosts? 1 Chronicles 29:11, yours, Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the majesty and the splendor. Yours, Lord, is the kingdom. In their determination to get rid of Jesus, they committed blasphemy themselves. Blasphemy that they charged Jesus with. Sounds to me like these are the guys that deserve death, not Jesus. So the takeaway, let's never give into the pressure of the world we live in and compromise our loyalty to God, who loved us so much that he suffered all of this. The flogging, the bleeding, the pain we can't even describe or imagine for us. Let's close in prayer. Father in heaven, we can't even imagine what it was like for Jesus. We can't even imagine, even though some of us in this room have lost children, seen them die, we can't even imagine how horrible this was for you to watch this going on. But we thank you, Lord, for not canceling your plan. Thank you that you went through with it and that Jesus went through with it and that he was willing to suffer all this for us. Help us to always be loyal, to trust you, to love you, and to tell others about you. In the name of Jesus, who went through all this for us, amen.